Living my bucolic life, we have 3 city strife. Horses, chicks, and dogs, they are my neighbors. I cook and sell and spin, and move the horses into the barn. Then time to move them out again. Red barns, green pastures, beautiful white houses. The view I see each day when I arise. This life pleases me, as it is plain to see. I'm living my bucolic life.
Hello, welcome back. And today's project is going to be working with familiar fabrics. I've been dealing so much lately with finicky things, the stretch velour, the velveteen, the incredible shrinking golden embroidered thing. Today I just want basics. So I am dealing with cotton, 100% cotton. This was actually in with the Christmas holiday prints, but I don't think it looks terribly Christmassy here. And I snagged it when it was on like super duper clearance. So I'm gonna make a light and flowy dress. It might not be the best thing to wear right now in middle of January, but it'll come in handy. And I'm gonna be doing this pattern here. See if you can focus. It's a McCalls pattern, and I'm basically going to be doing the one that the model here in yellow is wearing, which is with the sleeves that come gathered up, it looks like in a little band, and kind of a mid-length. The one down here is more of a full length. I'm thinking more moo-moo-ish, complete length, whereas this one is not. So I think that this should be pretty easy, I hope. I'm not actually seeing any notions being requested, at least not on the back of the pattern envelope. I haven't opened it yet. So I don't see zippers, I don't see buttons, I don't see anything. I just see a whole bunch of gathers and very big open sleeves. So I think this could be actually really comfortable. So the fabric though that I'm doing, there you go, it is light, and I think that if it's in the summertime and I have bright, bright sunlight behind me, you might be able to see through. And so just so that I have full confidence to wear it, you know, being kind of old school, I am going to line the skirt part only, and I'm going to be using this, which is Bemberg rayon. You know, it's my go-to lining here, which is a very, very lightweight silk feeling rayon fabric. So I'm going to be just doing the skirt part, not so much the top part. We will see. This has some unusual shaped pieces, but we'll make it work. I just wanted to show you, these sleeves take up the entire 45-inch width of the fabric. So what I need to do, because I do have a direction, I want to make sure all of my plants are upright. What I'm going to do is place it here, figure out the length that I need. I'm going to make a clip down here and tear it straight across. I have the big piece of my fabric that's still attached on the bottom, okay, and it has its plants going this way. My little cut piece that I put has its plants going that way. I have them right sides together. So now I can put my sleeve pattern on top, cut both of them at the same time, making sure that my direction of my sleeve is right. So here's my top. Everything's going to match up. I'm going to go ahead and cut out 2 sleeves. So while I'm cutting this out, I'm just going to mention in my comments previously, there's a question on how come pattern companies, these big 4 pattern companies, don't have apps for their patterns, because it seems like it would make sense. You know, I thought it would make sense. So a couple minutes ago, I, out of curiosity, called Simplicity and talked to a lady named Susan, I believe, who's in pattern marketing. I'm not sure. She seemed very strong in her convictions, if you know what I mean. And I was told that Simplicity, at least, will not be creating an app because all of the information that we could possibly want is on �simplicity.com website. She didn't want to elaborate as far as, well, she didn't seem to understand why apps are sometimes a little more convenient with different formats and different ways of sorting and things like that, and choosing and personalizing. But in case you ever wonder, at least with Simplicity, there is a website at �simplicity.com, and you can look at that website on your phone, so there is no need for an app, according to Susan. And this is the last piece I'm cutting out. There are inseam pockets, 2 of them, so that's nice, and they are a generous size pocket. But I did pre-wash on hot and pre-dry both of my fabrics before I cut them out, both the cotton and the Bimberg. The Bimberg, it's been said to shrink. I don't know that I've ever actually experienced it shrinking, but just to be on the safe side, I do pre-wash that also. So let me go ahead and get all of my little pieces up here. There's not very many of them. You of course have the pockets. There is a bodice front that you cut 2 on the fold, a bodice back that you cut 2 on the fold. Then this is just the little cuff that goes around the bottom of the sleeve. And then the 3 big pieces. You have the masses sleeve that you saw, and then there is a skirt front and a skirt back. I'm going to go ahead right now and cut out those 2 skirt pieces, which are cut on a fold out of my lining fabric. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is work with my bodice front and bodice back pieces. I have tested my heat erasable pin. It disappears entirely when I iron it, so I am good to go to start marking things up. So there are no circles on the back. On the back, there's a couple notches here, and I'm going to clip them like this, and this is how I clip my notches for all of the future marks. I'll just show you on here. I clip it in like a fat 1/8 of an inch. It's enough for me to see, but not enough to go anywhere near the seam line. So actually, I misspoke. On the back there is a dot, and it is back here at the seam allowance point, basically where this seam allowance is going to meet up, or that seam line is going to meet up with this seam line. Kind of an optional to market point, because at that intersection you're going to know where it is, but I'm going to anyway. So what I do is, this is a piece of thick leather. This is my hole puncher. I stick my leather, here, I'll do it on here. I stick my leather underneath the pattern, but on top of the fabric, so this won't come anywhere near the fabric, and punch the hole out. And then I can come back with my heat erasable pen, color in that dot, and I am good to go. So I'm going to go ahead, clip all my notches, mark all my circles that way, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I have my marks made on the wrong side of my fabric. That's the right side. And on the center front, this is an important mark right down there at the bottom of the V of the neckline. Okay, actually, that looks a bit off center. I'm going to move it over here. Okay, so what I need to do is sew these together at the shoulder seams. I have 2 of each, 2 fronts, 2 backs, and I'm going to be doing this for both sets. So here's one set, here's another set. Just at the very top, I'm going to match up each of the shoulders, sew them at 5/8, and press them open. Now, usually I will be serging around each piece first for a fabric like this. I'm actually going to hold off until we sew these 2 sets together, and then I'll serge down the edges. I think that that'll just be a little bit cleaner. I'm going to be using my little Vesta machine for just a bit. I'm not going to sew the entire garment with her, but it's good to get them used every now and then. So, in case you have never seen her, she is my little hand crank, German hand crank machine. Love her. And we're just gonna move on along. The hand cranks are just kind of fun. get down here to the end, and she does have a reverse, so I can back it up a couple, so that is nice. And then pull it out. My bobbin thread does not match my top thread. I just have one shuttle. I actually have two shuttles right now of this, and I don't want to have to rethread it at this point. So since these seams aren't going to be visible, I think that that's okay. And I talk about this machine in an old video I have explaining my Meister sewing machine, because this is kind of like the predecessor to it. So if you're interested in her, you can look at that video. But hand crank machines are nice. They're very quiet and very portable. So anyhow, she still makes a nice little stitch. You know, I got a peach going on the back, but that's okay. That's all right. So I'm going to go ahead, sew up both of my shoulder seams on the other piece, and then I'm going to press these open. So with these shoulder seams sewn, pressed open, I'm putting right sides together of my two pieces, and I'm going to be sewing them around the neckline. But before I do, I'm going to take one of them that I'm going to be looking at, because sometimes when you're sewing a deep point, it's easy to lose track, at least for me. And so I'm just going to draw that line. So I can, with my ruler, set the edge to where my dot is here, and I can see that it's actually closer to about 1/2 inch. So if I line up my ruler where my 1/2 inch mark is on the edge, by the time I draw my line, there's enough space between where the ink comes out and the ruler that it actually works out to about 5/8 of an inch. But I'm going to draw this angle here to that center point that we made there. And again, on this side, the same thing, lining up this edge here and this with, at least for a little while, probably a couple inches, it's straight, and then the neckline curves a bit, and I can draw that. That's going to give me a very good guideline to follow while I'm sewing. So now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and pin my two pieces together with the right sides together, matching up my shoulders first. Okay, so I'm back over here on my Meister. Here she is. And I just wanted to show you, I start in the center back here, you know, anchor away, and work my way around and get to the sides. Make sure your seam allowances are still pressed open. Keep going. Alrighty, so there's a little closer. So here's my red line here, and I'm going to try to make sure that I come all the way up to that point. Slowing down till I get closer. All right, right here, I'm going to leave the needle down, lift up the presser foot, turn everything, and then head back north on this line and work my way back around. All right, so here is my little dot. I have it all stitched, as you can see. There you go. So I have it stitched, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is start up here on this side and clip all the way down to just inside those threads, okay? And then do the same thing over here. Sorry about that. Start up, it's a couple inches above that dot, and also clip down to that dot. Okay, and that's going to take the bulk out, so it's easier to turn that down there. What I also need to do is make some clips just around here, but especially in the back area, so that around this curve it will lay nice and flat. There is no interfacing here. There is no reinforcement. They didn't have you stay stitch, because the first thing you do is sew this neckline seam here, so that's kind of working like a stay stitch. So it's an extremely lightweight neckline right now. I do not see them asking for it to be understitched though. They do not ask you to understitch it. They just say turn it and press it. So that is what we will do. I'm going to go ahead, open this whole neckline up, put one inside the other. Oh, this is very roughly turned to the right side. But the first thing I want to do is make sure my little V point down here is going to lay nice and flat. And it will. If it looks like it's not, like it's binding up, you may need to clip it a little bit closer to your stitching. So I'm going to go ahead, go over to my ironing board and try to very carefully press these seams open. What's going to make it easier to do is if before you try to close them up, if you come in here and you press everything open, okay, then when you go to fold it in half, it's a lot easier to get that seam line at the very edge where you want it. So that's what I'm going to do. First, press the seam open all the way around, a step at a time, then close it and then press it flat. Okay, so it's all pressed, as good as it's going to get with no understitching, as you do. What it wants you to do now is come back and baste the edges together. I am going to be serging the edges together at this point because they are not going to be tucked in. They are going to be exposed the way that they're going to have you sew the sleeve on. So I want to make sure they're not going to unravel. So I will do my best to cut off very, very little of the edge, if anything, but just make sure that the serging finishes it off really nicely so that I don't have any fraying going on, but also that's going to help hold the edges together. So I just want to make sure I match up my shoulder seams, my bottoms, my tops, everything in between, and serge all the way around the outside edge. Okay, so with that bodice piece serged around the edges and pressed, I just have it over there on my dress form just hanging out. Now it's time to get started on this massive sleeve. This thing is huge, and that's because it comes all the way down to the waist. Hang on, let me get the pattern here. I don't know if you can tell, maybe on the diagram it'll be a little clearer, but these sleeves are gathered and they go all the way down to the waist. So the whole side, there basically is no underarm because the sleeve is open. So that should be super comfy. But what I need to do is do some markings. I've got some notches, I've got some dots, I got dots here, and I am also going to be marking up here at the top. There's a center dot. I'm also going to be notching that because it's just easier for me to find that center shoulder seam when I notch it. Okay, now we're going to be running gathering stitches this whole length, but before I do that, I'm going to serge it up the side, across the top, and down just along the very edge before I do any serging. Before I do any gathering. Now, before I totally separate everything, I've made my marks on this one side. I'm putting a big, well, medium actually, red letter B on the corner of the side that is the back of the sleeve. The other one is going to be the front of the sleeve. I'm not marking it, but this way I'm not going to lose track because this piece looks very symmetrical, so it'd be pretty easy to lose track of all of that. Okay, so this pattern has a lot of long gathers in it, okay? And so just be aware. These are my sleeve pieces. I have serged all the way around both of them. Now, because they're going to be long lengths of a lot of gathers, even though it's a lightweight fabric, I am going to be using a super heavy duty thread in my bobbin. And I think I'm going to wind a new bobbin because it doesn't look like there's much on here right now. But what I would suggest, the stuff that I have, it's actually a fishing line. It's a woven like nylon fishing line, but you don't need that as long as you have something super strong in your bobbin. A buttonhole twist would be fabulous. A quilting thread would be good, but just something that you can pull on, and for sure there is no way that that thread is going to break is what you want. I just put a standard thread up on top for my needle, But these are the bobbin one is the one that I pull when I go to gather. So with that, I need to run some gathering stitches. Now the sleeve version that I'm doing has a cuff at the bottom that this is all gathered into. So I'm going to need to put gathering stitches on both the top and the bottom. And on the top, it's all the way, remember there was this little dot right here, which is basically at the 5/8 inch mark. I'm going to start here, go all the way over to that point on the opposite side. I'm going to do 2 rows, one at 1/2 inch and one at about 1/4 inch seam allowances, okay? And then I'm going to come back down here and do the same thing on the bottom. Okay, so at this point I've got stitches. I have my needle thread on my right side, my bobbin thread on my wrong side. And I just wanted to point out, if you've never put a super thread in your bobbin with a regular thread in the top, at least in my experience, it tends to make the stitches unbalanced, okay? But that's okay, because usually the fatter threads on the bottom are going to actually be tighter than the needle threads, which is going to give a little bit of a nubby feel back here where it's pulling the needle threads back. But that's okay, because that's going to mean that they're actually easier to pull and gather that way. So good thing that way. When you're done gathering, pull that bobbin out and put a different one in. So now that I've got that, I need to sew up some side seams. So trying to get all of my gathering stitches out of the way. We don't sew it all the way up. There's this dot right here, a little more than halfway up, and that's where we're going to sew. So let me just get all of this stuff out of the way down here. I'm going to match it up at the bottom and match it at that dot on both of these. And okay, and so in this part right here, that's where I'm going to sew it. I'm going to sew 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then afterwards press this open. I'm going to leave this top part like this open for right now. I'm going to do that on both sleeves. Okay, so at this point I've got a lot of strings going on here, so just to simplify it, I'm just going to pull these outside thicker threads away so that all of these inner ones, which are basically my needle threads, I'm just going to tie a big loopy knot here, stick my straight pin through that loopy knot to the end of my seam allowance and pull that so that I have a nice little knot right there at the edge. And so now I'm going to clip it, about 1/2 inch or so from that knot, and that just gets rid of some of the confusion. So now this is the gathering part for my cuff. I need to press the seam allowance open. I already did it on this one. So this one is ready to go. Let me go ahead and press this one open. Okay, with that done, I need to get my little cuff piece here. We're going to put the cuff on before we put the sleeve onto the dress. Now, just like the whole front part, there is no interfacing in here. It's just a nice soft folded cuff. Okay, so really, there's not a whole lot of marking. The side seam's going to match up with the side seam on the sleeve, so we're pretty good. What I need to do right now is get these, fold them in half, right sides together, and then sew this outside seam here at 5/8 inch and press it open on both of these cuffs. Everybody, it's actually been a couple days since we were last sewing these together. But I back up here. Hopefully we'll get a big chunk of this taken care of today. And the last thing I think that I showed you is I was about to sew this seam and press it open. And now I need to start gathering my massive sleeves in there. So this bottom part here on, let me just turn the camera down. All right, so here is my sleeve, and right now it is inside out. I need to turn it right side out. But one, I have it gathered stitches on both sides. The top is more rounded, the bottom is straight. So I'm gonna flip this right side out and match it right sides together with my little cuff. There is no interfacing, so this will hopefully go together very well. Actually, before I do this though, what's gonna make this a lot easier is if I have some landmarks marked. So right now I'm gonna lay it down flat, you know, with this seam over here, and put a little red mark where the center point is, and another one where the quarter point is on that side and right here. And that way I can match those points up with my cuff, and that'll make it a lot easier to get everything nice and regular. So let me just mark those on here. Just, you know, it doesn't have to be exact, but close enough definitely helps. So now I have a point on here, dividing it into fourths, and on my sleeve dividing it into fourths. So first thing I'm going to do is slide my little cuff onto there and pin those quarter marks. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to turn the entire thing the opposite way so that the cuff part is on the inside of the sleeve. That will just make it a lot easier to match up. Okay, so now that I have it pinned in there, I am just going to pull my super duper strong bobbin threads and work all these gathers all the way. So I'll pull from one side up into that center point until this is flat, and then I'll come back and pull the strings on this side to level these out. At this point I have it all cinched up together, so I am just going to tie my big old gathering threads into a knot and clip off some of these tails so I don't have all of that in my way. But there it is. I think it's gonna gather pretty well. I'm glad I'm using a lightweight fabric. I think if I was using a very heavyweight fabric, it would be very, very dense, but we're good. So I'm gonna go ahead and gather the other sleeve up just like this. All right, so now that I have both of my sleeves pinned onto my cuff, I need to sew it right here at 5/8 of an inch all the way around. Now, if you have a free arm machine, yeah, just pop that thing on there and start going. I use a old school flatbed machine, so to me it is easier when I'm sewing gathers. I want to be able to look at the gathers so I can keep an eye on what they're doing. So for my machine, for my flatbed machine, I actually turn my sleeve right side out, because when I'm sewing it, I sew it kind of like this and work my way around it. But that way, while I'm stitching in here, I can see all of those gathers and I can straighten them out if I need to. So, okay, so just to kind of show you what I'm talking about, I've got it set in here with the gathered part up. And if I put this hand inside, I can kind of, as I'm working, get my fabric that's gathered and tuck it down, you know, so it's nice going the right direction. So that way, you can watch everything. It's all gonna go nice and smooth. Let me do it up here. And keep an eye on it, because if you're not watching your gathers, sometimes they can go sideways or something and get themselves all caught in a way that's not very productive, you know. It's a hard angle here, but I'm just going to try to hold these ruffles nice and tight. And then sew straight over them like that. Okay? And that way I can work myself around, and it's not a big deal if there's an issue and something has gotten cockeyed. I can fix it before I actually stitch it, which takes, going slow like this, it takes more time to sew, but it takes less time to pull out and fix later. Now I just looked at the instructions, which I probably should have done before, and I'm seeing that what they want you to do is slip stitch it and then come back and machine edge stitch it, which is an interesting thought. And I'm thinking, if I had looked ahead and saw that what they wanted you to do is edge stitch it, let me tell you what I would do. When I sew my cuff on, instead of sewing it to the right side, I would have sewed it to the wrong side. okay? And then if it was sewed to the wrong side, then when you go to flip it over, you could come back and just top stitch it. And you could see everything very clearly on the right side, and you wouldn't have to slip stitch it. So it's kind of like they're wanting you to do double stitching on one little cuff that's not going to be under any stress at all, which is kind of an interesting thought to me. So what I need to do is fold it under and turn it down so it's just past that stitching line. Okay, and I am going to be, if I have to edge stitch it, I don't want to slip stitch it also. It's just me being me. So what I'm going to do is make it so that the edge of my fold comes about 1/16 of an inch below my stitching line. And then when I get my pins, I'm going to pin it so that the head of the pin, oh come on, lots of layers there, is sticking out this way, okay? Because I'm just going to be sewing it from the right side. So keep going around. Actually, I'll do the opposite side here. Fold it under about 5/8 of an inch. And yeah, I do have a lot of bulk here, but it's inside the band and there's no interfacing, so I think that'll be okay. So again, fold it down about 5/8 of an inch, bringing it down below that stitching line, about 1/16 of an inch, and popping my pin up here. So if I pop these sides now, they should pretty much fall into place where they should. And I can just put a few more pins, holding it in place nicely, like this. All the way around. So now I have this pinned very carefully. This is the right side. I'm going to come back and run a row of edge stitching up here all the way around at about 1/16 of an inch in, all the way around both of the cuffs, and that should seal up my entire band here. This is it. And I did this stitching looking at it from the right side, not the wrong side. That way you can guide it carefully. And this is about where it will lay on my arm, I think. You can see there's a lot of room there, so that's nice. I don't think that that's going to be a problem at all. So the next thing is to go ahead and sew this big sleeve onto this vest-looking bodice part. So silly me, I just walked around my sewing room looking for like 10 minutes, looking for another sheet of instructions. I think this is the first pattern in a very, very long time where there is only one piece of paper for instructions. We are right here, and that's the end. So yeah, just one sheet. Don't look for a second one. So I was trying to just kind of get an idea of what in the world this thing is, and where we leave our sleeve open here, that actually is part of the waist. So yeah, this is going to be the waist coming around there. So that's why this is open. So anyhow, the bodice here has notches in the front, and the front has the V. And I went ahead and marked them just so I could find them easier when I was using this piece last. And so I'm going to go ahead and pin my sleeve, first making sure I have the right one. So on this one, if I open it up, I have the letter B here, which means back. This is the front, that's the wrong sleeve. So I need to get this one. On this one, if I open it up, this says B for back, and it's over here on the back side, so I'm good now. So I'm going to go ahead, here's my center, my shoulder mark, where I made that little clip. I'm going to put it up here, matching it at my shoulder placement. And then I have notches, and at the very end of my gathers, okay, that is where I'm matching it up down here at the bottom of that little bodice section. So once I have it all pinned together, get my, where's my notches? Here they are. Match these notches up here. Then I'm going to go ahead and pull my gathering stitches, get them all evenly placed up and down the whole side from here. Again, the front is just like the back. Just going to match my sleeve corner here with the front of my bodice piece. And remember, there's a point right there on each side of the bodice and the sleeve. Okay, I'm start stitching at that point. I'm leaving the seam allowance open, but I'm going to start stitching at this point. Okay, so got it pinned on, and these are actually fairly loose gathers, not a whole lot going on there. So what I need to do is sew it at 5/8 of an inch the entire length, and then come back and sew it again at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'll have two seams going on here, and then once that is done, I need to press this seam allowance towards that center bodice. All right, I know this is very busy. I don't know if you can even tell what you're looking at here. Let me stick this in there so it becomes more defined. Okay, so this is the front V, and right here I have gathered sleeve on. Here I have gathered sleeve on. Okay, so I have my seam allowances being pressed towards the bodice part. Okay, I'm just going to call that center part the bodice part. And if you look on this side, you can see it better. I've got my 2 rows of stitching, one at 5/8 and the next one at 1/4 inch in. Okay, what the instructions say to do now is to come back and trim close to this second row of stitching. I guess they don't want all of this stuff in there. And the thought is this row of stitching will keep it from unraveling all the way in. So you know what? That is what we're going to do. I'm just going to use regular scissors too. I was thinking about using my pinking shears, but we're just going to do what the pattern says. So when I trim it, I'm just going to kind of be very careful and trim so that I am about 1/16 of an inch away from here. Now, when I sewed this, I left this open below the dot. Now that I'm looking at it, I don't think that's really necessary. So when you sew your sleeve onto your bodice, you can go ahead and go all the way to the bottom of the fabric on both sides. You know, it won't hurt me this way when I go to sew this seam on, it'll catch it, but just letting you know that's not necessary. So let me go ahead and on both of these seams that I just made, make this trim. Sometimes when you have to trim really close, you want to make sure you don't cut over that stitching line. So what I do is when I'm trimming, I'm looking on this side and I'm just kind of lining up so that I can see the stitching line on that side of my scissors. You know, if I look at the other side, I might go off track, but if I just try to line up this side of my scissor blade with the stitching line, then when it closes, it works out to be pretty close. So okay, so here she is so far. I just wanted you to see the bodice comes pretty short here, right underneath the bust, but that's the design. That's how it is on the pattern envelope if you look. So it's going to be almost like an empire type of a waist. But that's okay. If I pull these sleeves straight out, you can see that they come straight out from that waist area. So there's not going to be anything binding under your arms on this one. And when I was ironing it, you iron it so the seam allowance is here pressed towards the center. I kind of ironed just a little bit of the gathers so that they're laying a little bit flatter, but it's nice. I think that this part here, coming in at that diagonal, it actually gives the impression of a princess seam or something right there. So it's kind of nice. I like it. It's very different. Now underneath the arm here, it's kind of hard to tell, but because that is at the waist, this bottom of the sleeve is actually the continuing of the waist. So different kind of assembly, different kind of design and construction. Always love it. We need to get started on the skirt. Okay, so going on with the skirt here, what I have is 4 pocket pieces cut out of my main fabric, and the skirt pieces, this is the front, this is the back. I also have the same pieces cut out in lining. So both the front and the back are cut on a fold, so I have basically one back regular and back lining, one front regular and front lining. My plan is I am going to make the regular fashion fabric, this stuff skirt, put the pockets in, everything like normal. Then before I attach it to the dress, I'm going to also sew the side seams of the lining together. I'm going to layer them together and then attach that to the dress. So the first step is going to be getting my pockets put onto my fashion fabric. So starting with the pocket piece itself, the only mark I have is a notch here. And while I have all 4 of them layered, I'm going to clip that notch. That'll help me with my placement. For the front piece, there is a dot up here. This dot is going to match up with that point where the sleeve comes together with the bodice part, you know, that funky opening area. That's what this is for, so that's important. Also the side seam, you know. Down here on the skirt, there's these 2 dots. Those are going to be dealing with the stitching lines when we sew the pocket on. So it'll be like that, come stitching around, stitching down, you know. So I need to mark those. These only on the fashion fabric. I'm not really going to be worrying about making any of these markings on the lining part. For me, just having them marked on the cotton is good enough. So let me go ahead, get my hole punch, get my heat erasable pen, get everything marked on my front piece. Now I am just pulling my lining piece away, but because my front and my back look so similar, I'm just going to write the word front on here, just so I can keep everything straight. So I'm going to set the lining piece aside and open this up so I have my right side up. Okay, so this is my right side of my front piece. You know, it's a lot bolder here. And so I'm going to grab one of my pocket pieces I made. When I was marking this, I cut a little notch here on the side, and I'm going to need to match that notch up with my pocket. So I will be serging these side seams, but I want to put the first seam of my pocket on first. So it's going to be a little bit interesting. I'm going to sew the pocket on, serge it, and then flap the pocket back and understitch it. I think that'll just be a lot cleaner for me. So I need to find a pocket piece that I can put right sides together here. Find my notch, and this busy fabric blends very well. Alrighty. And I'm just going to pin it here and do the same thing on the other side. And basically what I'm doing here, we're going to do for all 4 pocket pieces. There's 2 on the front and 2 on the back. The exact same procedure, the exact same order of steps and everything. You know, you've seen it once, you've seen enough. So usually the first row of stitching for these inseam pockets is a smaller seam allowance. Let's see what they're going to ask us for. Okay, it says on the pattern what they want is to sew this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to do that. So again, what I'm doing here, just assume I'm doing that for all 4 pocket pieces. Sewing it right here at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then before I leave where my sewing machines are, I'm going to serge around the entire thing. So in case you've never seen this, I want to show you when I'm talking about serging all the way around it, this is how much I'm cutting off, which is basically not much of anything. And the way to get a really good corner is I come all the way up until my needle just passes the fabric. Okay, so I'm at the very edge of my fabric here, with my needle is up. I lift my presser foot, turn the fabric, put it back down, and again, just start off. Okay, and by doing that, I can get a really nice corner. Well, it has a little thread there, but you don't have long tails to deal with and everything. You don't cut anything off. It lays nice and flat. So that's what I mean when I say that. So I'm just going to keep serging all the way around this. Now this is the back. The front and the back skirt pieces are exactly the same as far as construction. They might even be the same as size. I haven't looked at that yet. But I'm coming up to the pocket. So here's my pocket, and I have it stitched at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I am just going to move this thread over here, just serge it, and the serging will encapsulate both the pocket fabric and the skirt fabric. So that's why I waited until after I had the pocket on to serge it, because that way it's just 1 row of serging instead of 2. It cuts down some bulk and everything like that. Okay, so it is sewed at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, serged over the edge, and now where the pockets are, I need to fold my pocket over, keep the seam allowances going out. So even underneath the pocket, seam allowances are still going out. And I'm going to press this nice and flat out that way. Okay, I'll do that to all of them. Then I need to go back to my sewing machine, and right up here, right on the pocket side of this seam, I'm going to run a row of stitching, you know, just barely inside, like a 1/16 of an inch inside, straight down. That stitching's going through the seam allowance and the pocket. It's under stitching, and it's going to hold that pocket nice and flat. So I'm going to do that for all 4 pockets. Okay, so this is what my top stitching looks like. You know, just barely on the inside. So before I leave my table over here, I wanted to point out a lot of times when I'm doing pockets, I serge all the way around my pockets before I sew them on. And I just wasn't thinking about it. But what I am going to be doing, because I can't leave this raw, because, you know, it might fray a little bit, it will be encapsulated in a lining, so it won't be that big of a deal. So I'm not really stressing out about it at this point. But once I sew my pockets together, I'm going to pink them around the stitching. So I think that that would deter any fraying that might happen. But yeah, usually I do serge around my pockets before I sew them on. I just didn't do it this time, you know? Sometimes you just don't. So I am just carefully pinning them together, right sides together here. Matching up. There's a notch, there is the bottom point, top point, these 2 points where I wanted to make sure that where the pockets join is going to match up here. And just pinning those carefully up and down the side. Now before I pin around here, I want to make sure that where the seam over here is, that's matching up where the seam over here is on the bottom. So if I stick a pin right here at the stitching line about midway through my pocket, I want to make sure that that pin also sticks in at the seam line of the bottom layer, if you can see that. Okay, so I can tip that pin upright and just pin it in, and that'll just hold it, excuse me, to keep the 2 pockets from wanting to shift back and forth. And I'm going to go ahead and pin a few key points all the way around this pocket here before I start drawing in my elusive stitching lines. So the dots that I drew earlier, I think I erased when I ironed, but that's okay because I keep my tissue paper handy until I'm past that point. So there's a dot right here, about 3/4 of an inch down in the pocket, and then this one down here a few inches up from the pocket. Okay, those are going to mark the stitching lines. So the way we're going to do this is at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm just going to draw the whole thing just to show. Here's where I need my stitching line to end. Okay, so you don't need it all the way up, but that's what it's going to look like that way. Starting up here, coming all the way down, ending at that point there, okay? At this point, you know, back stitch, anchor it in. I'm going to turn it, come in this way, and start going around the pocket. still at a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around there. So I'm coming back up here. Now before I show you where I'm going to come up there, I need to draw this line. So here's the top of my side stitching. And I'm lining up my ruler with the 5/8 inch mark at the edge of the fabric just to get a look there, okay? So when I'm coming back up here, I can run to this point, okay? You can come straight in, honestly. You can kind of come up at an angle, however you need to. Get to that point where this stitching line is, turn it, and I'm going to go up here, back stitch it, flip it around, and head straight down all the way to the end, okay? So the racetrack's going to look like coming here, up and around, up, turning it, and going straight down, all right? Now the stitching on this side, right here, see, remember our first stitching was at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so it's right here. So we have 3/8 of an inch beyond that to do our second line of stitching. That's on purpose because that way all of the seam allowance, the bulk of all this is actually kind of stuck into the pocket. So we want it way out here. Don't shortchange yourself, okay? So on the same down here, here is our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So make sure you come past that seam, at least a 1/4 inch. 3/8 would make it accurate before you turn to go up and down. Okay, let me go ahead and stitch those. Alrighty, so I've got it stitched here. For right now, what I'm going to be doing, you can kind of see here where my stitching comes down, turns, comes back this way, and then I took it up, left my needle in, flipped the whole thing around, turned down, and just went all the way down. So with my pinking shears now, because I did not serge my pockets ahead of time, I'm just going to come in here, you know, about a 1/4 inch-ish, maybe a little less it looks like, because I'm getting a little out of hand here with my scissors. I'm just pinking the edges from around these pockets. So let me do the other side, and then we're going to go to the ironing board and press these. Okay, so over here at my ironing board, I'm just going to pull my skirt on to the ironing board here, and I need to know which side is the front. This one has the letter B, so that's the back. So that means this side up here is the front. And so I'm going to take out that pin, lay my pocket so it's facing the front. You want to do that. You can't put your hand in your pocket if it's going backwards. So down below the pocket, if you can see in all of this busyness here, I need to press this seam allowance open. So starting down here at the bottom, I'm going to work my way up. When I get close to my pocket, I need to clip into the seam allowance. I'm going to leave myself maybe about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam allowance, you know, still intact, and open it up and then continue pressing. Okay, so now it's open here. Everything is going towards the front at the pocket. And then the same thing up here. Here is where my pocket is ending. So I'm going to open that up and clip just the back seam allowance just above that pocket. So then I can continue opening that up and pressing it open nice and flat. Okay. And then you have to go around the other way and do it the same way. Okay, so now that that is done, I'm going to sew up my lining really quick. And remember, I cut it out the same. I marked an F on the front, or I put the word front on one, and the other one is the back, obviously. So what I'm going to do for this one is I'm not going to be worrying about pressing my seams open, and I'm not worrying about pockets on this. Okay, so what I am going to be doing though is first sewing down the side seam at 5/8 of an inch and then serging it, because I'm going to press these together. This lining is extremely thin. If I press them together, it's going to be fine instead of pressing it open. So I'll be doing that on both sides here, so I end up with Where's my other piece? Here it is. So I'll be doing that on both sides, okay? So then I'll end up with a skirt form that I can start with to incorporate into my other piece. Okay, so here is my lining, my side seam I serged. After I stitched it, press both seam allowances towards the back, and then around the top of my lining skirt, I just serged around it just to keep it from unraveling. I have not serged the bottom, and that is because I'm just going to do a serging rolled hem to hem my lining. And I don't know exactly what level it needs to be. I won't know until I hem this. So I'm just holding off on touching the bottom of my lining for right now. But what I need to do is get these two put together. So let me see what I'm doing here. I can tell from the way that these are clipped that I'm looking at the back of it upright. So I want to make sure that I put the back of my lining skirt, and I'm putting wrong sides together. So I'll have the right side of my lining visible here. So this is my lining skirt back. I'm just going to kind of swallow up the main fabric inside of the lining piece and match up these side seams. Hang on one sec. So just once more to make sure this says front, and the piece I am holding here says front. So I'm doing good. So I'm just going to match up the side seams of these. All right, so I have these two layers pinned together all the way around. And I'm going to start working with them as a single unit. So what I need to do is baste them together before I put my gathering stitches in. So I am just going to run a row of basting stitches just barely below my serging line, because if I get much farther than that, I'm going to interfere with where my gathering stitches are going to be. So next day, you know, full details, new sleeves. And so I have this sewn together, combining the lining skirt and the fashion fabric skirt. So over here at the side seams now, on the inside of the dress you won't see the pockets, you know, and you only see the right side of the lining seams, which is nice. So what I have to do now is put my gathering stitches in. Now that they are combined into one working unit. And on the pattern pieces, this has an F, so this is my front, this is my back. They're totally, looks like identical to me. But there's a couple dots here and here, about 8 inches from the sides. That's going to be matching up with that front section. I need to run 2 rows of gathering stitches between those 2 dots on both the front and the back. So the first row will be about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The next one will be about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to use my standard thread because that's not a very long length, and I think it will be just fine. And I will be right back. Okay, so I've got my gathering stitches in there, and my bobbin thread is on my lining side, so that's the side I'm going to be pulling to make my gathers. So I'm just going to kind of open this up for a minute. This is, I know I marked it. Okay, this is my front side, that's my back side. So I'm going to take my little bodice top here and make sure I put it in the correct way, matching up the back to the back and the front to the front. So if this is going to be my side seam over here, well, it looks like it just wants to, this is an odd thing here. Hang on a second, let me look at this underarm seam here really quickly, because it looks like in their picture it just lays nice and flat. They don't have a lot of instructions here. Let me show you what I'm talking about. This is that underarm seam right here, okay? And they only had us sew halfway. And I need to be able to open this up and sew this straight across here as the waistband. and I can't the way it is. I have to clip something. Something's got to give because it's not going to shape right that way. So what I'm going to do is come in here. Here's where my stitching ends right there. So you can see this is where my stitching is ending right there. I'm just going to come just a little bit above it and clip almost to that seam allowance, you know, give myself a little bit of space there to keep it from exploding. And I think that way, when I open it, I can kind of overlap that little bit there and have a straight place where I can sew that waist onto. It's very interesting. I do not see anywhere in here where they tell you to do that. I might be wrong. You never know. It just says pin bodice and sleeve to skirt, matching centers and dots. So that's what I'm going to have to do. Otherwise, it's just not going to fit. Alrighty, so the first thing I'm going to do is stick this in there so the front is going with the front, the back's going with the back, and I'm going to start with matching up my side seams. Okay, so here's the clip that I made. I actually need to come in here and make one more. This is the second side. I already pinned the first one. And the sleeve is going to make this abrupt curve right here, and if you don't clip it twice, it just does not behave well. So now I need to turn these two that was the first clip into a single long piece, okay? So it's starting out, let me see if I can show you. This is the seam on the sleeve, okay? This is that underarm seam that we only did halfway. This is where the stitching ended. That's the first clip, that's my second clip, okay? So what I'm going to do now is open it up here, where that opening is, all right? And I need to make this one straight piece. So I clipped it a little bit at an angle, not a whole lot, but you can kind of see how it's bending in that way, okay? So that when I open it up here, it's the end of my stitching right there, and I have just a nice flat little piece that's kind of overlapping itself. Let me put a pin in here to hold it, get my fingers out of the way, okay? So that's what it looks like here. That's how I'm going to be sewing it onto the skirt. On this side, you can just see it's kind of laid on top of each other, all right? And then continuing on the stitching here. All right, so now that I have this with my little pin, here's my pocket down here somewhere, I'm going to match up this location here to my skirt piece, all right? So I'm putting the very center seam of my skirt in line with that. And I'm going to stick a couple pins in here really quick just to keep everything from not wanting to move. And I am not going to take out this pin until I sew right over it. You know, it's just going to hang out there with its buddies for right now. So if I move it over to the edge here, where I start my gathering stitches is where this part right here is. And you know, there's one of these on the front and the back. So right in between these 2 points, you know, right here, that's where all the gathering is. Underneath the arm, no gathering. So I'm just going to line this up, making sure my seam allowance that we, you know, double stitched and trimmed for that bodice is still going towards the center here. And I'm going to pin that. And so everything in between here should line up. If it looks like it doesn't, stretch it out, bend it, it will be okay. You know, that looks kind of wonky, but if I bend it like this, it'll work itself into the most natural position. And then I can just get a couple pins and pin it, and when you sew it, it's all going to work out, no problem. So this kind of thing that we did right here and matching up this way is what you do on both the front and the back on both sides. So at this point, here are my sides, and here is my, what is this? Is this the back? I think this is the back. Doesn't matter, same process. So what I'm going to do is match up, you know, my center to my center here. That looks about right. pin those together, and then I can just pull the gathering stitches to cinch in everything in between here. So once again, these are my bobbin threads. It's a nice quality thread, so I'm very hopeful that it will not snap on me. All right, so I've got it all pinned together, and the instructions want you to baste this together first before you go to the sewing machine. And I think with all of the crazy little corners and seams and everything going on, I think that's actually a good idea. So I'm just getting my, heavy duty basting thread there, and gonna get my needle and my bobbin, my thimble, and just hand baste it all the way around. I'm probably going to be doing it about 1/2 inch down, but the good thing about, basting threads is if they do show when you go to stitch it, you can always pull them out. So that's not a big deal. I just want to get my bastings fairly close to where my 5/8 inch stitching line is going to be, especially like at that point underneath the arm where all this craziness is going on, so that it'll be held where it should be. So I think I will pop something on to listen to here for a minute and just baste my way through. This is also a very good time if you have any easing that you need to, it would help if I put a knot at the end of this. If you have any easing that you need to work in, when you're basting it by hand, you can kind of work that ease in as you go. I just thought I would mention how I actually work the ease in as I'm basting, okay? So here's an example where this is shorter, this is longer. So as I'm basting, I turn it over my hand, okay? So I have that curve. While it's curved, it matches up. It's only when you straighten it out that it doesn't. So I curve it over my hand, and while it is still curved, that's when I go through and baste my stitches together, okay? Okay, way too long of a thread here. And then when I open it up flat, it's all going to be worked in the most natural place. So trying to do this with the camera is interesting. Okay, so let's say I sewed this one while it was curved. Then when I open it up, you can see between these stitches and these is where there's a little bit extra, but that's not very much. And when you go over it with a sewing machine, it'll just flatten it in. So there you go. So as I'm basting around and I get to my ends where I have all of these gathering threads to deal with, I'm reaching in there and tying them off because it kind of annoys me to have that much going on. So I just kind of tie them in a nice little knot there. Use pinking shears to clip the threads because why not? Alrighty, so now that I have this basted all the way around, you can see it's not perfect, it's not fancy, but it will do the job, which is to hold everything in place. So it's not going to want to shift on me when I'm sewing. So go over to my sewing machine, sew this around here at 5/8 of an inch. And then I believe we do it twice. Yes, we do. So just like that front part, I'm sewing it at 5/8, then I'm going to come up 1/4 inch and sew it again at 1/4 inch all the way around. So I'll have 2 rows of stitching here when I'm done. So I've got it sewed on with my 2 rows of stitching here. And I would say do yourself a big, big favor. Do the first one, the 5/8 inch one, and I did it while I'm looking at the gathers, so it's this way through the machine. Okay, that way I can pay attention to it. But before you do your second row stitching, take it out, hold it up, make sure everything is good, especially this underarm area, because it gets tricky. And when I pulled it out, one of the sides, it had this funky like locking folds thing going on. And basically I needed to cut another notch in here so that it would want to shape right, because it's a strange little angle there. So after you make sure that that works out, then go ahead and do the second row of stitching, the 1/4 inch. Now what the instructions also want me to do is come back and trim very close to this second row stitching. I'm not going to do that. I got quite a bit of weight on this skirt because of the lining, even though this is the weird thing. There's this weird physics thing that happens with lining. You can put a very, very tissue light lining onto something, but once you get it into the fabric, it feels twice as heavy at least. I don't know if it's because it's trapping air better or something. I just don't know. I'm going to go ahead and put this on my dress form so I can see how it's hanging and how I can go ahead and get the hem strategy taken care of. All right, so this is what we have so far. I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of this whole thing here. I haven't tried it on since I put the skirt on or anything like that, but it just seems like you're kind of tying the sleeve to the waist. I'm not sure. I'll have to put it on to tell you. But it's very full. I don't think there's going to be any problem with waist or hips or anything like that, or honestly even the bust being too small, because all of this in here is one big wide open thing. I'm holding it out. I'm not going to make a judgment yet. Not making a judgment, but I want to go ahead and tip the camera down so you can see what I'm going to be doing down here at the hem. So down here, excuse me, I've just kind of like gently tugged on the skirt and the lining to make sure that nothing's being cinched up. In some places the lining is actually hanging longer than this fabric here, and I don't know why. I think it has something to do with the way that all of this stuff up here is attached. It's just odd. It's really odd. What I'm thinking right now is I am going to do just a very basic hem at the bottom. You know, turn it under and turn it under again. Not a huge hem, maybe 1.5 inches, and I'll show you up there. I don't want the lining to show. And to me, it's not important that the lining comes all the way down. So what I'm planning on doing at this point is cutting the lining, cutting 4 inches off the bottom of the lining all the way around. That, and then just doing a nice serged edge around it. I think that will be fine. I think that will make sure that the lining's not visible from the outside. And that's good for me. I'm not going to be attaching it to this skirt. I'm going to keep it so they can be separate. So let me take this back up to the table and let's hem this. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is pull the lining out so I can get it done first, because this is the easy part. I'm going to get my ruler and just start making some marks. It is, if I remember right, it's a very, very slight curve. It's not a huge curve, so I want to make sure that I have it correct. Sometimes if the hem is curved and you cut straight across, it ends up not being even. So if I just make little marks like this, I can come back with my scissors, follow them all the way across, cut off a big long strip. Okay, so as you can see, I have just serged the bottom edge of my lining, which is fine. And I just glanced at the pattern, and at the bottom of it, it calls for a 5/8 inch hem, which is not very big at all. That's just a narrow hem. If I turn it under, you know, just past my serging about 1/4 inch and then turn it again, that's basically a 5/8 inch hem. So it's a very narrow hem. And if that's what they want, that is what they will get. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it up, press it so I have it nice and flat when I go to sew it, and then just machine stitch it. Just run a straight stitch all the way around. volume? Do we have volume? Yes, we do. Okay, so here it is. And surprise, surprise, I can move my arms. Here's the key. This band here, when you go to lift your arms up, it has to slide up your arm. So my advice is when you're making your cuff, make sure it's big enough to go around the fattest part of your bicep. If you can do that, I think you'll be able to move your arms. If it's a little snug, you might want to make it a little bit bigger. But in general, I think it's a cute little dress. It is very cold out here right now, so yes, I have my thermal leggings on under this, but up top it's a bit chilly. But that's okay, the sun is out. So I hope you liked it. I have to say, I think lining the bottom was a good idea for me. Just because this fabric is so lightweight that it gives it more oomph and warmth, obviously. And also, I don't have to worry about, things being able to show through. It was one of my daughter's friends, I think, when they were teenagers, and I was explaining why we used to wear slips and why I still wear slips. And she says, what, people think that girls did not have legs? And I was like, oh my gosh, no. So I don't even know how to explain it. You probably understand what I'm thinking, but it just feels a lot more secure. But the skirt is not terribly wide. You see, this is how wide it is. The pockets are deep, and even though it's got this thing on the top here, how often do we honestly reach for the skies? Mostly I'm around here, and this sleeve actually works really good for this amount of lifting. And if I go higher, well, I can go higher. It just lifts up a little bit. But anyhow, that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Living my bucolic life, free every city strife. Horses, chicks, and dogs, they are my neighbors. I cook and some spin, and move the horses into the barn. Then time to move them out again. Red barns, green pastures, beautiful white houses. The view I see each day when I arise. This life pleases me, as it is plain to see. I'm living my bucolic life.